I'm Ann Tovak. I'm the CEO of the Workers Circle, and I'm so glad all of you are here as part of tonight's genealogy experience, where we'll be speaking with Libby Copeland, who's going to talk to us a lot about the new genealogy, which is studying DNA and taking those DNA tests. And it begins by putting saliva in a tube, and you really open up a whole new world and maybe a whole can of worms in some cases. So Libby's going to explain to us. If you're joining us and you're new to us, I want to tell you that the Workers Circle is a social justice organization that builds progressive Jewish identity through Jewish cultural engagement, Yiddish language learning, multi-generational education, and all together we come together and use our traditions and activism to change the world. Our focus is on immigrant rights and economic justice, and of late we're really intent on being a partner in the national campaign to end systemic racism. And in support of that, we're working on voter rights. This summer is a new Freedom Summer in 2021, where the Workers Circle is joining a national coalition committed to the passage of the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And our democracy is in jeopardy, and it's so important that we have to continue to state this in every forum that we can. And I hope many of you on this Zoom will consider joining us in the coming weeks of activism. But I also want to reflect that one of our featured programs is our educational communities. And we have connected with our guest tonight through our Westchester school community. And it's a wonderful opportunity to share with you that we have schools throughout New York. We have a school in Boston, in Chicago, and they're not just a Sunday school for kids to learn about their culture and activism and traditions. They're also a place where the parents gather, and really it's a family community. So if anyone's interested in that, you are very welcome to inquire and be a part of those communities, and you just go to circle.org and you'll learn more. So I'd like to move forward and get started on tonight's program and introduce our guest. Libby Copeland is an award-winning journalist and author who writes from New York about culture and science. As a freelance journalist, she writes for such media outlets as the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Atlantic, and Smithsonian Magazine. Her book, The Lost Family: How DNA Testing is Upending Who We Are, was published by Abrams in 2020, and it explores the rapidly evolving phenomenon of home DNA testing, its implications for how we think about family and ourselves, and its ramifications for American culture broadly. The Wall Street Journal says it's a fascinating account of lives dramatically affected by genetic sleuthing. The New York Times writes, "Before you spit in that vial, read this book." The Washington Post says The Lost Family reads like an Agatha Christie mystery. Who are we? What is family? Are we defined by nature, nurture, or both? It was recently named to the Guardian's list of best books of 2020. So it's my pleasure to welcome you, Libby, to the Workers Circle Zoom.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. I love being part of the Workers Circle community, and I know just a bissel of Yiddish, but some of what I know I learned through Workers Circle. So,
and we're thrilled. And I just want to say before we jump in that people can put Q&As, can put questions in the Q&A, and we're going to leave time at the end to answer as many questions as we can. And I think you can also put them in the chat, but I believe the Q&A is probably best. And we will get to your questions at the end. We're going to leave at least 15 minutes at the end to answer your questions. So having said that, and it is really like being like welcoming community to the Zoom, maybe you can start by telling us how you came to write The Lost Family: How DNA Testing is Upending Who We Are.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So I've been a journalist for over 20 years. I spent the first half of my career at the Washington Post. And since then, I've written for a variety of publications. And I really am interested in technology and how technology shapes us and sometimes shapes our most intimate selves. So a few years ago, I was in conversation with one of my editors at the Washington Post, and we were talking about DNA testing, which at the time was like it was growing and it was sort of on our radar, but it wasn't as big as it is now. And we were starting to hear stories kind of bubbling up about, people getting unexpected results, right? People finding out, they weren't genetically related to the man they considered dad, or, other scenarios, discovering long lost siblings, that kind of thing. And I was really interested in the what happens next situation, right? Like what I wasn't so much interested in, you discover your long lost sister and then you have the reunion and then we leave the story there, right? Which was a lot of what I was seeing in some of the reporting. What I was really interested in was like, how does this change your personal narrative? How does this change your conception about your family, the degree to which you trust your parents, your ideas about your roots? How does this change your ideas about what ethnicity is and how it is formed? How does sort of editing and re-understanding, if you will, your own beginnings change the trajectory of the rest of your story? And so I wrote a story. It was kind of like a long piece actually for the Washington Post. And it was like one woman's tale that I just thought was so compelling. It ran in the summer of 2017. I got this absolute flood of reader email. I got 400 emails in the first few weeks. And they were almost entirely from people who had read the story and wanted to say, that was a great piece, but I want to tell you my DNA testing story. I discovered this unexpected news. It was completely surprising. It reconfigured how I thought about myself. I'm still sitting with it. It happened 3 months ago. It happened 3 years ago. I still haven't processed it, right? And I started getting on the phone with people, and I found these stories so moving because these were people expressing how technology had touched them where we are all at our most vulnerable, which is in the conception of ourselves and are the people that we love the most, right? And people being forced to kind of reconsider that maybe they didn't really truly know the truth about the past or about themselves. And it was those conversations which were quite, I felt really privileged to be able to report them. That was when I thought, my gosh, this is not just a newspaper story, right? This is a seismic change that we are enacting on families, on individuals, and on our culture at large. This is a moment we're going to look back on and be like, wow, that was the era of genetic reckoning. That changed everything. Now we talk about things differently. Now parents talk to their children differently. Like I felt strongly that we were going to look back on this as a real sea change. And I wanted to capture that moment with lots of stories. And I decided at that point to write a book.
Wow, that's incredible. We're going to talk about one of the stories that you talk about in your book. And I do want to let everyone know that tomorrow we're going to send an email to everyone on this Zoom that will have links to the book, to articles, and other facts, and a newsletter that Libby puts out. So, don't worry, you'll get all that information. Do you have any sense how many people are taking DNA tests right now? In the United States, let's just say, so please.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so when I started writing my proposal for the book 4 years ago, there were 8 million DNA test kits sold across the 4 major companies. And just to back up, the 4 major companies, and we're talking here about home DNA testing for ancestral purposes, which is where the market really is, right? This is the bulk of the growth in DNA testing for, consumer DNA testing. So the 4 major companies are Ancestry, which is the biggest database, 23andMe, which has the second largest database, MyHeritage, and Family Tree DNA. And those 4 companies collectively had sold 8 million DNA test kits 4 years ago, and today we are closing in on 40 million.
Wow.
40 million. Now, the bulk of those tests are being sold to Americans, rootless Americans, grandchildren, great-grandchildren of immigrants who have, curious about their roots. Nobody is as into genealogy as we are. We are deep into it, we Americans. Mm-hmm. And we are all kind of becoming a nation of seekers, which is the term I use for people who try to understand themselves through understanding the past. So all that growth that you're seeing, that has, the bulk of that growth has happened really in the last 4 years.
I mean, that's an incredible amount of information that's now floating around the internet and the ethos.
Mainly about American DNA. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, now we'll talk a little bit about some ramifications. I mean, it's really incredible. And by the way, as we're talking, somebody I know, who's a longtime Workers Circle member, it said that she's right now watching this Zoom with a cousin she identified through a DNA test. So just
so cool. I love that. That's so cool.
It's just incredible. I'm sure there's more stories, and we'll have to sort of poll our community later on as far as how many people are doing this and what they've discovered. But we're going to talk a little about the story of Alice Collins. Is it Playbook?
Yeah, very close. It's Playbook. Yeah, Playbook.
And this frames your book. And we aren't sure yet if we'll spoil the story or not, but we may not. And everyone, you can learn more about this in an article in the Washington Post, as well as this incredible book. But your book frames her quest around DNA to learn more about herself, and has some twists and turns. So why don't you take it from here?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so Alice Collins' Playbook. She is a retiree living in Washington State. She is Irish, comes from a large Irish Catholic clan. So there's 7 Collins siblings. She's in her 60s when we meet her. She's a genealogist. And she is a technology maven, right? She's just someone who is extremely comfortable with new technologies. She's science-minded. And so back in 2012, when we meet her at the beginning of the book, she is interested in finding out if DNA can help her with her genealogical brick walls. If you're into genealogy, you know all about the burden and the frustration of those brick walls when the paper records they won't help you out anymore and you kind of get stuck, right? So she's researching some, ancestors in Ireland, and she's thinking, okay, I'm going to get DNA. I'm going to take the DNA test. I'm going to connect with some Irish cousins, and this is really going to help me figure out, who's from County Cork or wherever. And she takes a test through Ancestry, and she gets these results that don't make sense. The results suggest, eventually, when she's able to figure it out, that she is half Ashkenazi Jewish, which probably everyone here knows is a term for Jews from Central and Eastern Europe. It is not a term that Alice has ever heard before. She doesn't know how to say it. She doesn't know how to say Ashkenazi. It's just not something that she's familiar with. And it's so, unexpected that she just figures, well, I know my genealogy. I know my parents. So presumably this DNA testing company is just not all it's cracked up to be, right? Which is a very understandable assumption and a very common assumption. And in fact, at this point, companies like Ancestry get flooded with customer service calls from people who say, you mixed up my vial. You're telling me I have a half sister, but I know I don't. This says my dad's not my dad. You guys have it wrong. And with Alice, as with almost everyone else who makes those customer service calls, it is almost always we, the consumers, who have our stories wrong. The
Wow.
DNA testing companies, with maybe a handful of exceptions, they're not getting it wrong, right? And the science is quite robust as far as relative matching goes. So Alice is kind of confounded. Again, she figures Ancestry is all messed up. She decides she's going to take a test with 23andMe, right? 23andMe will know what they're doing. In fact, 23andMe's results confirm Ancestry's results. She is in fact half Ashkenazi Jewish. And this launches her on this odyssey that is 2.5 years in the making. And it is truly, it's truly an Agatha Christie mystery. I mean, that's why I wanted to choose her story to be like the backbone of the book. I think it's incredibly compelling. And it contains other stories in it. And I'll tell you why I say that. But basically, she has to find the needle in the haystack that will explain her story. And it takes her, it becomes her full-time job for 2.5 years, morning till night. She is working to use these sophisticated genetic genealogy techniques to understand how she got her story so wrong and who she truly is. And she's not afraid. That's the kind of thing that's lovely about Alice. She's smart, she's funny, and she is absolutely tireless. And so while most of us would say, like, I give up, she's like, let me dig in and create more Excel spreadsheets. Like, I'm just going to keep going. Oh, I know, I'll have my brother design an iPad app, especially for me. And she just keeps going, digging through all these Jewish cousins to understand how she's related to them. So why do I say that her story tells other stories? So Alice is very methodical. She decides that there are a number of theories that could explain her situation, from the more likely to the less likely, and she decides to methodically go through the theories and eliminate them one by one till she can figure out what's at the root of the explanation. So her first theory is that she's the product of an NPE. NPE stands for non-paternity event or not parent expected. It's a kind of a arcane genetic genealogy term that has become incredibly mainstream in the age of DNA testing, because a lot of people, hundreds of thousands of people by my estimate, have discovered they're not genetically related to the man they consider dad as a result of the DNA test. And the effect is actually much larger because it's affecting millions of Americans. So she figures, okay, I know who my dad was, but what if I was not related to the man I consider dad? What if I was genetically related to someone else? She investigates that theory quite methodically, and she's able to eliminate it. She's able to eliminate all the other theories that she can come up with. The possibility that she's adopted, the possibility that she's donor conceived, the possibility that she descends from a group of people who hid their genetic roots. So this does happen, and we know of stories, for instance, of light-skinned African Americans who chose to pass as white to escape rampant discrimination. We know of stories of Jews who sort of historically and in more recent times assimilated their way out of those identities to escape discrimination as well. So she's thinking maybe there's a group of Irish Jews who didn't, kind of pretended not to be Jewish. And she does that historical research, and she's able to eliminate that as a theory. And the final theory that she comes up with, which she is able to prove, is incredibly far-fetched. I mean, it is so completely improbable that the genetic genealogist who worked with her, who's pretty prominent in the field, said she thought it sounded like a soap opera, and she didn't think it could possibly be true. And it turns out to be true. And I won't say what it is right now, but it basically goes back 100 years. And so one of the great pleasures of writing the book was that I got to go back a century to do that kind of historical research, which was really fun. But what's amazing about Alice's story is that when I tell her story, it allows me to branch off, right? So when she's just exploring the possibility that she's a product of a non-paternity event, I get to write a whole chapter on non-paternity events, which is a really important phenomenon we should be looking at. I tell about late discovery adoptees, sprawling donor-conceived families of 50 or 100 siblings, and people whose families, hid their genetic ancestry in order to escape all the things that the 20th century were going to throw at them, right? And before. So Alice's story is a passage. It's a kind of a key to other stories. And some of those stories actually came from people who emailed me when the original Washington Post story ran. I was able to actually put their stories into the book. So that was pretty amazing.
That's just, I mean, it's all incredible. And by the way, we've gotten requests to tell the spoiler and not to tell the spoiler. I don't know. I mean, maybe we'll ask people to shut their computers or, go mute for a bit or turn off their sound.
So we can totally do that.
So you're talking about Ashkenazi Jewish heritage. And is there any points to that versus other cultural DNA that are worth, pulling out?
Yeah. There are challenges with testing when you're Ashkenazi Jewish. And there are other communities who have similar challenges, so we're not alone. But one of the problems has to do with the fact that we are considered an endogamous community. And that means that, historically and in more recent times, you have a lot of, cousins marrying cousins in tight-knit communities, second cousins marrying second cousins. I know I have that, sets of sisters marrying brothers or cousins. It's so confusing. Which one is this? And they all have the same last name, right? And when you have that historically over time within a community, and again, there are other communities that have this as well. And this is not incest, by the way. This is not close relationship. This is second cousins marrying second cousins, or just a lot of cousin intermarriage. when you have that in a community, because the population is relatively small, or either limited by geography or perhaps by culture and tradition or by religion, what you have is people are related to each other along multiple pathways through their family trees. So when you take a DNA test and you match to your Jewish cousins, they look like they're more closely related to you than they actually are, because you're related to this fifth cousin several times over. And you have a lot of little chopped up overlapping genetic segments. Now, those overlapping genetic segments are what allow the DNA testing companies to identify that person as a relative. But when they put all those little pieces together, it looks like that person is much more closely related than they are, because really you're inheriting genetic segments along more than one ancestral pathway. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And I've encountered this because I am half Ashkenazi Jewish, and then on my father's side, a colonial British, which is another endogamous community. If you think about, like, again, communities that didn't have a lot of options in terms of, population size, right? Who they could marry. So when I look at my results, instead of having like maybe a few thousand or 10,000 cousins, I might have 80,000 cousins, right? And it looks as if all those people are true cousins, but they're actually quite distant. And me attempting to kind of fish through and compare trees and understand how I'm related to them is in some cases going to be a complete fool's errand, because I'm related so far back, as Alice would put it, like we're related back to the time of Moses, right? And Alice, who's brilliant, would say, in the very beginning, before she understood the effect of endogamy, she would reach out to these people she was related to through Moses. And she would attempt to connect with them and compare trees until she eventually figured out that wasn't gonna help her at all. These people were way too distantly related. So that is something to know about Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry, that is a unique sort of situation, not that we only face, but that we as a community do face.
That's so interesting. And I will share that I believe my great-grandparents were first cousins. So and I'm not sure about that. Apparently, it's just funny. I wonder how many people on the Zoom also had that experience. So now I'm starting to understand. I did the ancestry, and I came up with a lot of cousins. So
yeah. And I mean,
that's part of it.
The people at the top of the list are going to be stronger, more closely related to you, and they're worth digging into. But once you get 4 pages in, good luck with that.
Yeah.
Good luck with that.
Well, I was really interested to find that number 1 was another person named Tabachnikov, and of course that's my historic name. So clearly we were connected, although they never responded to my email. So I know, but maybe I'll try again. But yeah, it's really interesting to see your results. I told you I had the experience of my first results came in and said I was 5% British, and a few years later I got an update from Ancestry and said, you're 99.9% Ashkenazic Jewish, and that brings me to like another question, which is, how confident can we be in the results? And also, how far back are we looking? Because how far back are our relatives? When it says Ashkenazic Jewish, I mean, we weren't always in Poland. I mean, we started out somewhere else, I guess.
Yeah, what a great question. Those are really good questions. So the kind of DNA testing that we're looking at now is called autosomal DNA testing. And that's what's most common, and that's looking at the DNA that you inherit from both your parents. I mention that because the industry has been around for 21 years, and it didn't start out with this kind of DNA testing. It started out with something that by today's standards is less informative, and the tests were cruder and they were more expensive. And so it's really only the last 5 years that you've seen this phenomenal growth. And a lot of that is because this autosomal DNA testing can tell you so much. It really appeals to people, especially those ethnicity estimates, those pie charts that you see in the commercials, where they're like, we're going to tell you how Italian you are, and there's like, there's celebrities, and you see celebrities like realizing they're very Italian, and then they're like walking through the bakery and they're buying biscotti and they're trying out their Italian. And the idea is like, you suddenly have access or a passport to your roots, maybe even roots you weren't aware of. And it's kind of like your access to a new world, right? But it's a little bit of a superficial appeal, right? At the same time, because you have to wonder, And this is one of the themes that I talk about a lot. What is the DNA versus the lived experience, right? Not to say that we shouldn't be curious about our roots. I'm deeply curious. Like, we're doing our genealogy as a family right now, and I can't get enough of it. But it's there's always this tension between how much emphasis we put on the value and the import and the truth-telling ability of our genes versus versus everything else that we know and everything else that makes up our identity. So, okay, we can come back to that. That's kind of a thick and dense issue. The two pieces of information you're getting from autosomal DNA testing are these genetic relatives in the database and this ethnicity estimate. The genetic relatives that's a really robust and reliable predictive system, because they're looking at overlapping segments. Granted, for endogamous communities, and I know someone asked me to say that word again, endogamy, E-N-D-O-G-A-M-Y. I think I spelled it right, endogamy. Granted, for endogamous communities, sometimes at the margins, so among more distant cousins, it will inflate the relationship predictions. Not for first cousins, not for siblings. Those are true predictions. But for most people don't have that issue. But these are relatives. They're just not quite as strongly related to you as the algorithm seems to predict, right? So that's one thing. Your relative predictions are quite reliable. Your ethnicity estimate is not quite as reliable. That is a different sort of scientific interpretive process, because what they're using is different means to get at those results. They're using different reference populations. So 50, 100, 1,000 people to stand in for all of Norway, okay? And then they say, this is what the DNA of a Norwegian person looks like. And then different algorithms for interpreting those results. And, we are 99.5% genetically identical to every other human being on this planet. We are so much more alike than we are different. Sometimes it seems we're quite different because we look different. But in fact, sort of under the hood, we are almost completely identical, right? And so the places where we do differ, those spots along the genome that scientists use to pick out ethnicity, those little spots don't have little flags on them that say Norway or that say England. They are just sometimes often associated with in a kind of a pattern, right, with other spots along the genome. And so these scientists are looking for patterns, and they're making interpretations, and they're getting better as the reference populations and the algorithms get better. And that's why when you test, you'll get a prediction that you're 27% such and such, and 6 months later they update it and it turns out you're only 20% such and such, right? And even that you should take with a grain of salt. So they're very good at continent-wide predictions. Like, they can tell DNA from Asia versus DNA from Africa versus DNA from Europe. And they can often get more granular than that, but really with populations that are quite similar to one another, they often can't, right? And then for Ashkenazi Jews, we stuck tight as a unit and traveled around and sort of stayed to ourselves and married within the group. So it's very difficult to tell Polish Ashkenazi DNA from Ukrainian, right, Ashkenazi DNA. And that's not even taking into account the fact that these borders didn't exist, right? So you're looking at anywhere from 500 to 1,000 years ago is like the starting point, right? The true north. Although, is that really the most meaningful point in time? If you keep going far back, we would all be in Africa, of course, right? So we've sort of arbitrarily decided that this is the point in time that interests us, because it is the point in time before our people, presumably, if they were immigrants, emigrated to the United States. But because of the fact that there weren't bright lines between countries, and people in France married people in Germany, and then the border shifted and Germany didn't exist, right? At a certain point, it's in some ways very dependent on the subjectivities of our current now in terms of how we view historical maps of Europe and so on.
It's interesting hearing you speak about how we're really like pulling apart some, we're all very similar in DNA, and yet we seem to be focused so much on what our differences. I wonder if this is having, significant ramifications in sort of bringing up the differences versus this, the similarities. And it's interesting because you heard at the beginning, for example, the Worker Circle and many others are really trying to wrap our work and our ideas around being a part of a country where systemic racism is so much a centrality. So are these DNA tests harming our societal visions of ourselves, or helping, or maybe a little of both?
Yeah. So that is a question I want to know the answer to. And I devoted quite a bit of space to kind of exploring this question. And I still continue to pay attention to the research because I'm very interested in it. On the one hand, this stuff is not meaningless, right? It is incredibly, it adds to the depth of your life to understand where your people came from, right? We follow the story of Alice in the book, and I'm friends with Alice now, so I talk to her all the time, right? And Alice was able to extract so much profundity, so much great deep meaning from understanding her Jewish roots, right? And connecting with Jewish relatives. Now, not every person in her family drew as much meaning from it. And that was one of the things that interested me. There are 7 Collins siblings. So Alice and her sister and her 5 brothers. And they all had a different relationship to how important this discovery of Jewish identity was to them. One brother said to me, well, I'm still Irish and everything but DNA, right? And the DNA was like, just not that important, right? But for Alice and her sister, it was incredibly important and felt almost like a reclaimed identity, like maybe something that they felt they had known on a certain level that they were now able to fully embrace. And you hear that from other people. And yet, on the other hand, right, is there a danger in reading too much into genes as a blueprint, genes as a predictor, genes as suggesting, great fixed immutable differences among the races? So there's a great deal of concern among sociologists, for instance, about the idea that these tests may be reinforcing racial essentialism, which is this idea that we're deeply different from one another, when in fact we are not. That what we're dealing with when we're talking about race is, fundamentally a social construct. That there's all these kind of political and social categories that we've created, and we've said, oh, this is race, right? And that the differences that we see are, they're things that these companies kind of pick out and reinforce when they give you that pie chart that says you're 27.6% XYZ. So, there's a sociologist at UPenn named Wendy Roth, and she's done some research, and others have done research as well. But the most informative study that I've seen is one that she did, where she tried to understand whether, in fact, these tests were a force for good or a force for evil, right? And she found basically that it depends, and it depends based on how much genetic knowledge you go in with. So people going in with a basic understanding of DNA came away from these tests with more of a sense of the common humanity of people, right? More of a sense of the brotherhood, sisterhood. If they found diversity within themselves, that allowed them to kind of see themselves as related to everyone. If they didn't, they nevertheless saw that, we're all, almost entirely genetically identical. And it broke down barriers. People who went in with low genetic literacy, Wendy Roth found there's some suggestion that it may actually reinforce a sense of racial difference. And that's really interesting. And the last thing I'll say about it is that over and over, I found that people take what they want to take from these tests. Yes, they can be life-changing. And yes, people make these discoveries and they mean a great deal to them. But if someone is invested in a particular identity, they're not necessarily going to embrace what DNA is going to tell them. And that can be for a variety of reasons. And it's not always that we're being crazy and being selective, because our past and our experiences do form our identities, and you can read too much into DNA, right? And so, it really is a bit of a Rorschach test, how much meaning you derive from it. I think as Alice's family kind of illustrates, it really depends. Does this alter how you think about family and about things like, ethnicity and race? It very much depends on the individual.
Wow. As I will share that I was reading the Washington Post articles this afternoon, and we spoke, and listening to you now, it really makes me think twice about how significant these DNA tests can be to people, and yet we can just sort of do it as we can buy them on sale. They're always like the Black Friday sales. You can get them very cheap, and you have to be careful what you wish for, because I wonder how many people aren't really prepared for surprising results, and they get them, and are they really emotionally ready for them? It's
it's happening a lot. It's happening a lot. It's not happening to most people, although most people, if you talk to them, will say they've heard a story about someone to whom something happened, right? But it is certainly well over 1 million consumers of the 37 million who have tested, who've discovered a significant unexpected surprise along the lines of discovering they're not genetically related to dad, or that they have a sibling they didn't know about. But that actually is not the true scope, because if you think about it, these revelations ripple across families. If I discover I'm not genetically related to dad, well, that's not something that stays with me, right? That gets shared with mom, and it gets shared with dad. And then mom and dad have some pretty awkward conversations, right? And then I'm discovering that my siblings that I grew up with are genetically half siblings. And perhaps that explains certain things to me, things that I could never put my finger on, but suddenly this sense of otherness, or a stray remark that one of my parents made, years ago, suddenly that makes sense, and it contextualizes. You hear this over and over from people who've made these discoveries, that they had a sense that something was wrong, and this sort of contextualizes it. Then there's another family out there, let's say 2 states away, right? And there's a guy who's a stranger, and he contributed half my genetic material, and I might want to know him. I might want to reach out to him, and my act of reaching out to him without knowing if he wants a relationship or not could be a blessing in that man's life, and could be a burden to him. And it's going to impact him, and it's going to impact his wife and his children, who I'm now discovering are my genetic half siblings. So each revelation, kind of ripples across 8 to 10 people. So you're talking about millions of Americans, and we're not prepared for this, because who is there to hold your hand when you make this kind of discovery? First of all, people don't expect it. They give you these little advisories when you test. They say you may discover unexpected relatives, or you may discover things about yourself that make you change your view on the world. But honestly, it would require a bizarre leap to expect that you're about to spit into a vial, and the discovery that you make is going to completely, make you question everything you've ever known about yourself, right? And question what your parents told you. So that just doesn't happen for the most part, unless you're going in with suspicions. You're not prepared. And, in the world of medical testing, there's always a gatekeeper, right? And that gatekeeper, there may be discussions about whether you want to be informed about incidental findings. You tested for one thing. Do you want to know if you find out about some risk of some other disease? They may decide not to tell you when you go in to test for organ, if you can be an organ donor for your parent. They may not to tell you that, oh, by the way, we found out you're not genetically related to your dad, right? There's certain things that they may not tell you, and that could be good or bad. I'm not pronouncing a judgment on that, because a lot of people feel that they are so grateful to know the truth, even when it's painful, that they would rather know. But I will say that in the world of direct to consumer, there is no gatekeeper, right? So people are remarkably unprepared. And what happens to them is they wind up going onto Facebook support groups and giving each other support that way. But you're starting to see now a nascent kind of group of psychologists who are arising to treat folks. And over, when people discovered that they weren't genetically related to a parent, they described it to me as a traumatic revelation. It changed their entire conception of themselves, and it disoriented them to the point where there's certain phrases and terms and analogies that I heard over and over again, and I'll just mention one of them. I call it the lonely boat metaphor, and that is a description where you find yourself cut off from your own roots, cut off from your family, cut off from your understanding, your previous understanding of yourself. And multiple people described this to me. Alice called herself, she said, I was adrift. I didn't know who I was, who I really, really was. Another woman said to me, I felt like I'd been placed on a raft and pushed out to sea. It's this sense of profound disorientation. And that is an issue I think we really need to be talking about, and that mental health professionals really need to be looking at, because it's a big deal. And there's a lot of Americans sort of facing this experience right now. And they don't have anyone to help them through the process, and they're totally unprepared because they've gotten this DNA test kit as a gift for Hanukkah. And they bought it on sale, and they never ever thought that this would happen to them.
It seems like a really bad gift, sort of like giving someone who doesn't know they want it or doesn't ask for it a puppy. It's
well, yes. And on the other hand, I got my first DNA test kit as a gift from my dad. Wow. And it was amazing, right? So the thing is, you don't know what you don't know. You don't know what you're going to get till you open the box. It's the craziest bioethical conundrum. And that's why, like, honestly, I could talk about this for hours. Like, it's the most fascinating thing, I think, because you never know how it's going to play out. You never know how you'll react to the news. And honestly, you don't know how the people on the other side are going to react as well. And you have very little control over whether this man who turns out to be your father, who you've never heard of before last Monday, when you write him a certified letter and you inform him that you are his biological daughter, you literally never know how he's going to react and if he's going to embrace you or want nothing to do with you. And it's sort of like an amazing study in human character. And a lot of the stories that I told in the book, I wanted to tell because I thought that they illustrated or illuminated some unique aspect of this, because I think, the stories are as varied as we are as human beings. And it's important that we normalize these stories, that we tell these stories, that we validate these experiences, because frankly, more and more Americans are going to be facing them in years to come.
Mm-hmm. Wow. I mean, it's, you really are opening up either a treasure chest, not with some sharp points to it. And I almost wonder if there's not a cottage industry arising of people who are there to help.
Yes.
Deal with the results.
Yeah, there's search angels who are volunteer, who will work with you, usually volunteer. There are professional genetic genealogists who might charge. These are people who can help you find your genetic kin. A lot of them work with adopted persons who don't have access to their original birth certificates if they live in states that bar them from that access. So those people can't find out their original birth certificate, so they can't gain access to the names of their birth parents. And many people consider that sort of a fundamental human and civil right? That people should have access to that information. There's a kind of a growing world of people who talk about your right to know your genetic identity. There's even an organization called Right to Know that deals with that. So there's these advocacy organizations, and yes, so there's this growing kind of world of people. There's a wonderful genetic counselor I know who runs groups for people. There are therapists who run online therapy groups. It's led to this kind of explosion of mostly kind of grassroots organizations and advocacy groups to help people.
It's incredible. I want to start getting to some questions. I do have one final question before we get to the questions, which is, what about privacy? When you share your DNA with Ancestry or 23andMe, I mean, what expectations of privacy do we have? And we've recently seen some police cases that were turned on DNA. What are we doing? What information are we sharing with a very open world?
Yeah, so it depends on the company where you test, and it behooves the consumer to do some research. So the biggest of the two companies, Ancestry and 23andMe, are not cooperating with law enforcement. So they're not, it's kind of hard for law enforcement to access their genetic information. You have to spit into a vial, you have to send it in. Law enforcement doesn't really have a back door. So they have to go in through the front door, which is like a subpoena or a warrant, and that has not so far been successful. There are larger questions questions about privacy when you talk about genetic testing. So when you're talking about the fear of genetic discrimination by insurance companies, which is something that has been talked about a lot. I haven't seen concrete cases of insurance companies actually discriminating against people, but a prominent bioethicist I interviewed said he felt it was just a matter of time. If that happens, my information is certainly vulnerable because I'm in 3 databases because I tested at 3 of them, right? So I come at this as someone who has, both as a genealogist and enthusiast, but also kind of aware of the pitfalls, right? And we also don't know what happens if one company kind of gets purchased from another company, 20 years down the line, and they have a consent policy that's different than the one that you signed, because the only people who are really regulating this are the companies, right? There's not like oversight above that to say, here's what you may do. It's not HIPAA protected, like your medical information. So what you're hoping is that these companies are committed enough to consumer privacy because their butts are on the line, right? Their reputations are on the line, that they're not going to sacrifice that. But on the other hand, there's a small company called Family Tree DNA down in Texas, which started the industry. And I was able to travel down to Texas, interview the founder, and get the whole founding story. As I was writing the book, news was coming out about how they had decided to cooperate with the FBI to help them solve cold crimes, and they didn't even tell their consumers. Wow. So, that is an illustration of the way that, the companies can make these decisions kind of unilaterally, and the consumers are left in some ways without recourse. A lot of people were in favor of that, by the way. A lot of consumers were in favor of that because they were solving horrible crimes and homicides and sexual assaults, but a lot of people were not.
Yeah, no, it's no joke when your privacy is invaded, or your own genetic material is open source.
Yeah, and I want to say one more thing on the question of privacy. I know you want to get to questions.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
So we have almost 40 million people, right, in these databases at this point. One of the privacy issues comes from the fact that even if you are not tested, you are effectively opted in. What do I mean by that? I share genetic segments with other people. And I have taken a test. And so in many ways, I have effectively opted in my third cousins, in the sense that if somebody is genetically related to a third cousin of mine who's not in the database and trying to identify that third cousin. So let's say a third cousin of mine had a child in high school and didn't know it. Let's say it's a guy, he had a girlfriend, they had a relationship, he had a child. She didn't tell him she was pregnant. And then he went up and the next 30 years followed and he never knew he had a child. And that third cousin's child is looking for him, but he's not in the database. That third cousin's child can match to me, and through third cousin matches, divine the identity of her genetic father.
Wow.
Even though he never took a test. So when you're talking about privacy, almost the entire nation, almost all of the United States is effectively opted in, to the extent that you may discover things about your roots, your family, your health, without ever having taken a test. And that is why I think it's really important to talk about DNA testing, both because all of us have reason to be kind of invested in it, and because I think it really dramatizes certain age-old essential human questions having to do with genetics and identity, nature versus nurture, what is family, what is ethnicity, like these questions that we've always thought about. I think it dramatizes those questions and brings them home to a lot of us in the modern age.
It's really incredible. And wearing my workers circle hat, we are in the world of progressive Jewish identity. But we've been searching for it through traditions, through values. This is a whole other world. And in some ways, it can be quite exclusive, I think. And that's something that's also, an anathema to the values we teach. So, and yet we all are also invested in heritage and tradition and history. So it's sticky. I see a really interesting question from Lizanne. She asks if there's a particularly good test if you're looking to see if you have roots in another type of Judaism, such as Mizrahi, a Jewish culture, Mizrahi or Sephardim. What do you have a recommendation for which tests might help? And are there any issues where the tests aren't as accurate around different types of Jewish heritage?
Right, that's a great question. So I can't vouch for how good they are, but I believe that my heritage and family tree DNA both claim to be able to pick out beyond the Ashkenazi. So again, Sephardim. I believe, but I'm rusty, and it's not, that is not so much my area of expertise, because I'm a journalist rather than a genetic genealogist. So there are often questions that I wish I had a genetic genealogist on there with me to answer. In general, I will say that if you're looking to connect with relatives, because you think you're going to be able to compare family trees, and by comparing family trees maybe understand your roots, the bigger the database, the more likely you are to find close cousins. That's just kind of the reality of it. So Ancestry has 20 million, 23andMe has at least 12 million, probably more. They haven't updated their numbers in a while. And what a lot of people will do is they'll test at one or both of those, which require you to pay, by the way, spit in a vial and pay. And then they'll take their results and they'll upload them to Family Tree DNA and or MyHeritage, which are both free.
Huh. Interesting.
So that could be a tactic. A lot of people do that.
I'm looking, this is interesting. Did you explore the tension between wanting to know one's genetic history and the concern in a post-concentration camp era about how that data could potentially be used? And this person indicates
Yes.
both their grandparents were survivors, and a couple of people have asked about this. I guess it's very much at the forefront of our minds.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and yes, I mean, I've thought about it a lot. And in fact, in Germany, there's a cultural reticence towards DNA testing because of the history of that country, because there's a feeling that, sort of separating out people by their roots is quite dangerous and not the way we should be thinking about it. There's a scientist at MyHeritage that I interviewed for the book. And we were talking about this, and he said, and he's Israeli. And he was saying, on the one hand, he felt like if this kind of testing had been available 100 years ago during the era of eugenics, that it might have busted that pseudoscience. It might have shown how false it is, because then you could show everyone that we're just a mosaic of heritage and how similar we are. So maybe that would have been a good thing. And yet, on the other hand, he did acknowledge that it made him nervous, right? And we were talking right at the same time that the New York Times had just written a story about the Uyghurs and how the Chinese government was surveilling and forcibly taking the DNA of Uyghurs and tracking them. So the Uyghurs are the Muslim ethnic minority in China. And I said to him, like, can you imagine a world in which DNA is used in a way to separate and track people? And he was like, I can. And frankly, I don't have to imagine it, because I can just look to history to see the example of it, right? So I do think that is, I mean, I think that goes back to the theme we were talking about earlier, right? Does this reinforce our sense of sameness, or does it reinforce our impression of difference, right? Yeah. How does this information get used? And I'm very alert to the way that advertising is used for these DNA tests, because I think the advertising can veer in certain directions. It can suggest a kind of, racial essentialism. There's an ad for an Ancestry DNA test where they show a figure skater during the Olympics a couple of years ago, and this pie chart shows up on the screen, and it says, like, what's responsible for this figure skater's incredible talent? Is it her? I'm just going to make up the terms, but is like her British drive, her Asian grace, or her Swedish precision, or whatever. And it's like these ethnic tropes that are so reductive. It's so problematic, right? I think, unfortunately, a lot of us encounter our ideas about genes and ethnicity and race through DNA tests. And I think the companies have a responsibility to advertise in a way that doesn't reinforce that really wrong-headed and somewhat dangerous thinking.
That's a really important point. There's a question here that from Amy Brookman, which is very interesting. She asks if you can comment on discovering unknown parentage that exposes relatives on opposite sides of the master and enslaved relationships. Interestingly, there is a gentleman who is he's a performer who works with the Workers' Circle, and he tells the story of discovering that his family, and I don't know that he did it through a DNA, I think he did it through research, but that his family were enslaved, and then he discovered they were also related to those who enslaved them, and they discovered both sides of the family, and it actually led to a very interesting connection and a commitment toward moving forward from both sides. But how often does a story like this come up, and what are your comments? What are your thoughts?
Yeah. I mean, I've heard a number of these stories. I tell one of them in the book. And I just watched a talk recently at Roots Tech, which is this really large genealogy conference that happens every year. This year, because of the pandemic, it's all virtual and it's all online. And you can actually go to Roots Tech and watch some talks. There's a fascinating talk by an African-American genealogist who did this research. Exactly like you're saying, he was able to connect with his white cousins and explain the connection. And their response was, no, our ancestors, they didn't really own slaves, maybe one or two, and in fact, it was a franchise. It was a business for those ancestors, and he had to kind of say to them, no, it wasn't one or two. It was my people. And it was a lot of people. Right. And actually, I think, and if there's somebody, Danielle or Susan, you can pop this in the chat, but I had an op-ed in the New York Times in March. And I talked about exactly this issue, this idea that this is an opportunity for white Americans in particular to look history in the face, that our shared history, our acknowledgement of the cruelties of it that our ancestors perpetuated, right? That this is actually a moment for white Americans to see exactly what was done to other people, sometimes in the same genetic family. And I see that. I would like to think that DNA testing is that, in that sense, a kind of an opportunity for us to all start from the same page about exactly, how far we've come and where we were. So if anyone in tech in the background is able to find that, you can pop that in, or you can just look up.
She did, and
thank you so much.
And we'll also definitely share it tomorrow too. We love sharing information. These are all about, this is a journey we're on. We've been talking about our genealogy, and we started with talking, we've had a couple of sessions talking about how we can research it without our DNA, the DNA test. And this is an interesting piece that is also part of our history and how we approach it. I did want to share something I talked to Libby about earlier, which is as part of the Workers' Circle, we had been taking annual trips to Lithuania and Poland. And in fact, we're going back next year. And I've been doing it for a number of years now. When I first started, DNA tests were really not available in Poland, but now they are, and they're becoming much more prominent, as they are here in the United States. And what we learned was that a lot of Polish families are learning that they have Jewish connections. Excuse me.
Hi.
The age-old problem of Zoom, because there were many examples of Jewish families where they were facing Nazis taking them to concentration camps or to ghettos, and they turned their very young children over to non-Jewish families. And those hidden children were often raised as non-Jewish and quite frequently never learned their true identity. Now their children and great and grandchildren are taking these DNA tests and finding out they have a significant Jewish ancestry path. So it's creating a very interesting conversation right now in Poland, and I'm sure it's going to be only more interesting when we go back, because these tests are they're really spreading around the world. So it's just another dimension
Amazing.
that is becoming part of a narrative in Eastern Europe. And I'm sure it will really be across Western Europe as well. I think I'll conclude. Matt, someone pointed out Madeleine Albright. And also the gentleman I was talking about, the performer, is Reggie Harris. And if anyone is interested in this story, if you look up it's Reggie Harris, you'll find his site, and he tells an incredible story of learning about this and how, he and the side of the family that came from the slave owners really, I won't say they reconciled, but they connected and created a new community, and really like found their own truths. So let's conclude by asking you, do you have advice for people who are thinking of taking a home DNA test? And what is that advice? What's next?
Yeah. So I would say, we've, as a family, been able to make incredible discoveries through DNA testing, right? So I want to say that first. I want to say it's remarkable, right? And I also know people, for instance, we found a second cousin to my mom who was with the family in, Jews in Ukraine who we did not know survived the 20th century. We didn't know that my mom's grandfather left all these siblings behind. We didn't know all these people descended and survived. And we would not have known to look for them through paper records, right? Sometimes DNA can allow for breakthroughs when in concert with genealogical records that genealogy alone could not. And so that's a gift, right? And then, of course, I know a lot of people who had their whole heads turned around because of what they found. And the common theme is the immediacy of the past, right? This idea that the past is not over. It's actually sitting curled inside our cells, right? And we happen to be living in this moment where you can for $69, you can spit into a vial, you can get it sent to a lab, that crack it open, they extract the DNA, they amplify it, they analyze it, and then they tell you this stuff that happened hundreds of years ago or 40 years ago, right? If you're discovering you're not related to your dad, and the past is not over. Right? It's shaping us, and it's inside of us, whether or not we know it, whether or not we know all the ways it's shaping us. So I think that's absolutely remarkable. And so, I used to give the advice that if you're going to take a DNA test, you should sort of know what you're getting into. But over and over, I found people that's not something that you absorb because you don't walk into it thinking that something's going to happen, right? So the advice I kind of give now is for the older generation who may be in possession of knowledge about their children's genetic origins that their children themselves don't know. And that is that it is a matter of time before those children find out. Those children may not need to test in order to find out something germane to their understanding of themselves. It's not a matter of if, but when. And the era of family secrets is absolutely over. Absolutely over. And so if you are somebody in your 60s, 70s, 80s, and let's say you have a child who's donor conceived, and they were conceived at a time when, for very understandable reasons, doctors, you didn't tell your child because doctors and experts said you shouldn't, which was a thing. And infertility was stigmatized, right? And psychologists said it was better for the child not to know, right? All of that is very understandable, but this is the moment to consider. I think my advice would be to consider taking the hand of one of the many kind of grassroots organizations and genetic counselors and psychologists who are cropping up to help people in these situations, and seeing if you can't start a conversation with your child, because it is better that it come from you than that it come because they take a DNA test 10, 20 years down the line and you're no longer around to provide context and answer questions.
Well, that's an incredible way, I think, to end this conversation. I feel like we could go another hour, perhaps. We can at some point in the future. I mean, it's a new world, and we'll keep embracing it and keep learning different ways to view our identity. And I do want to put in a plug and say, remember, there are so many pieces to your identity, and at the Workers Circle, we really create a community where you can grow your own identity and understand that you're part of a community, and it's not DNA based. It's really about your values and how you use those values moving forward. So there's lots out there for us all, and I really highly recommend Libby's writing, and tomorrow you're going to get information to connect you to her book. And a lot of people are saying thank you. I think people really enjoyed this conversation. So I do hope we can continue it as we continue to explore our history and our shared connections and community. So thank you, Libby. And I look forward to continuing the conversation in the future.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you to everyone for joining us.
Thank you. Be well, everyone.
Okay, bye-bye.